Derek, today the question of the biology of sex, the psychology of gender are hot political topics. Can paleontology contribute to an understanding of some of these terms? For example, sexual selection theory?
Yeah, right. Sexual selection theory is definitely something that comes up in paleontology. So,
what is it?
So it comes from Darwin, and Darwin initially noticed. Actually, Darwin comes up with sexual selection theory in part because he's worried about a possible objection against his theory of natural selection. So, he looks around and notices that in many different species, the males in particular have traits that seem maladaptive. The famous example is the tail of the peacock, or fossil Irish elk that have these huge antlers that look like they would just get in the way of everything. And these look maladaptive. And so the obvious objection is, well, how could these traits possibly evolve by natural selection?
Because the big tail will be just something that a predator can catch
or something. Right. And so the question is, how could these have evolved? And this is where Darwin brings in his theory of sexual selection, which is the thought that, well, it has to do with female preference. Females of the species, for whatever reason, seem to prefer males with the flashy, showy feathers or what have you.
Fancy car today.
Or something.
Which sounds very sexist.
This comes up in part because in like dinosaur science, you might find examples of species where you might wonder, is this an example of sexual dimorphism that we're looking at? So, some of the crested hadrosaur dinosaurs, you might wonder, is that a trait that could have evolved by sexual selection, or it's at least it's a hypothesis, it's a possibility.
And the alternative hypothesis is that it's a trait that increases their fitness by itself.
Right.
Because it can make them stronger or able to survive in some way.
Right.
So sexual selection theory sounds like it's often the counter hypothesis to maybe a more traditional hypothesis.
Or certainly an alternative story aside, as distinguished from traditional natural selection, as Darwin thought of it. There's actually a question: would sexual selection just be like a special case of natural selection, or is it more properly thought of as like a different sort of mechanism?
Is that a distinction without a difference?
Yeah, it might. I think it's a low stakes issue. It might not matter that much.
But it is certainly an important issue in terms of the role of females. In other words, this is a potential case where females in the fossil paleontological history have controlled the lines of adaptation.
Right. So this is a case. This is an interesting thing about sexual selection theory. This is a place where it's really, really difficult to really think through the scientific issues without having our own values kind of come into play in various ways. And you can find. So critics have worried a lot that when you look at Darwin's own writings about sexual selection, that what's going on there is he's kind of taking assumptions about Victorian era gender roles and kind of reading them back into nature. And he describes the females as being, choosy, and the males being like aggressive and things like this. And that looks really kind of problematic. You can also find, and some scientists have highlighted this, kind of looking at this a little bit of a different way. You can find people who've highlighted that Darwin's theory seems to give agency to the females of the species.
Those are two descriptions of the same facts.
Right.
I mean, it's whatever you want to read back into it, but if the fact is right, the fact is the same.
Right.
And whether it's an agency or kind of a passive a reaction against male aggressiveness. I mean, that doesn't matter what you call it. If it's a fact, it's a fact.
And it might be. So maybe it could be that the bottom line is that we need some sort of explanation of these traits that we see, for example, in fossils, and it could be that something like this process is part of the story, maybe. Yeah.